We're going to talk about beer making with UW Professor Robin Shepard and our own Minocqua Brewery brewmaster, Ryan White. Ryan is the brewmaster here at Minocqua Brewing Company. His parents bought this establishment about 9-10 years ago, and they asked Ryan at that point if he would like to be involved. Well, he didn't know too much about beer making, so he apprenticed himself out at a couple of breweries, including the South Shore Brewery up in Ashland, and learned everything there was to know, and came back here and started making beer. So, and he is going to kind of follow up on Robin after he finishes speaking. Now I'm going to turn and introduce Professor Robin Shepard. Robin is one of those people who've been more successful at 2 careers than most of us are ever at 1. So that's a little bit daunting. In his day job, Robin Shepard is an associate professor with the Department of Life Sciences Communication at UW-Madison. His expertise is in environmental communication and in evaluating non-formal education and extension. So maybe we can get him up here to talk about environmental issues and outreach sometime in the future to talk just about that. His campus colleagues actually wonder what he actually does. His academic work has not been specifically about beer. It focuses on water quality, but since beer is about 95% water, it seems like a good fit. So that was enough to get him in the door on the topic, and he's now actually become kind of the unofficial beer czar at the University of Wisconsin. His colleagues will say if you want to get his attention in an email, put beer in the heading, in the subject title. He's likely to look at it. Doesn't matter what the subject really is, he'll probably open it and you'll at least get his attention and he might look at what you have to say. So Robin has traveled extensively in search for his own perfect pint, laying claim to having had a beer in all 50 states. Okay, so we have a trivia question here. Robin Shepard wrote a book about his favorite subject. Right here we have, and I bet he'd sell you one too. Wisconsin's Best Breweries and Brewpubs, Searching for the Perfect Pint. So that book was published in 2001. It's been a long time. That's 13 years ago. I think it's time for an update, don't you? I'll bet the brewing company isn't even in here. So.
It's on the cover. Look at that.
Oh, it's on the cover. It is. How did that happen? Amazing. Well, that is really great. Anyway, I still think it probably needs an update. So I think it's time. He's going to need a new title for his new book, right? So I thought we would vote on a new title, on a title for his next book, okay? All right, so you guys get to vote, and he has agreed, right, to use whatever we come up with. Okay, all right, this is A pub crawl up Highway 51. Beer pong along the Ice Age Trail. Or C, colorama, beefarama, and beerorama. All right, sounds like you've got beerorama. Okay, all right, thank you very much. Here's Robin Shepard.
Well, thank you for this wonderful venue. I'm trying to think back when I was writing my first book on Wisconsin. Yes, it's on the cover. I was here, and I'm just very fond of the whole North Woods. I think probably this region of the state may have influenced me more than any other region in the state, to tell you the truth about beer, because I remember when South Shore was in the old depot. You guys remember that at all? Was actually in the railroad depot. Not unlike what happened here, tragically, a fire forced the moving of that brew pub to where it is now in the Wilmarth department store building. But traveling has really what got me interested in this. I love to experience, what's happening locally. And so you got to eat and drink somewhere, right? You got to have a little bit of sustenance and a little bit of refreshment. So it got to be kind of a game for me. I think in the early 1990s, I was part of the homebrew culture. I had a buddy, and we discovered, home brewing over the kitchen. And then this little incident with a little fire in the kitchen sort of convinced my wife that we probably ought to go to his apartment to brew from that point on. On a more serious note, we would brew on a Thursday, I think, and then the following Thursday we'd get back together and watch a game on TV, and we'd be bottling or some other aspect, so we had kind of a little rotation going. It was just kind of a guy's night to do that, and that led me down the road of exploring what beer culture is all about. And I think probably by about 1995, 1996, I'd started kind of in my head playing a little game of tic-tac-toe. Where are all these breweries around the state? And by about 1997, 98, I think at that time, I had made a point to physically go to every brewery in Wisconsin. And just like all good researchers at the University of Wisconsin, research, what's it lead to? More research, right? So I figured I got to go back. So that's when I started thinking about doing a little writing. I'd been a news reporter in another life before I had decided to go into academics, and I'd missed that story, the storytelling that a lot of reporters find. And what I found was when you come into a place like this and you're sitting at the bar and you strike up a conversation with a Ryan White or a knowledgeable bartender, there's so many stories that are more than just what's in front of you. Everybody has a story about how they got here, why they took up brewing, what this building was before it took on a life of beer. And I just became fascinated by that. And what beer was for me is, sure, I love what's in that glass that's in front of me, but I can look around the room and, I love finding them. It's a big scavenger hunt to me. It's not about how much I can drink. It's about, can I find them, and can I find the story that goes into making that beer in that particular place. And so you meet all these wonderful people along the road when you take on a project like that. Whether it's Bo up in South Shore and knowing a little bit about his background and how he fell into this, or knowing that Ryan and how he kind of came to be was somewhat of just a labor of love and learning it on the job, right, Ryan? So there are people like that have followed their heart and followed their passion, and the next thing they know, they find themselves in a brew house making something that a lot of people enjoy. Let's think for a minute about, what makes beer special in the state we are. Beer has been with us even before we were a state. Statehood in 1848, same year the University of Wisconsin was founded. Go back more than 10 years before that. First commercial brewery in Wisconsin was down in the southwest corner near Mineral Point. John Phillips started his brewery. It was a commercial brewery, which is a distinction. There were probably a few other, breweries in the barn and a few other things like that, but this was the first commercial brewery in the state, 1835. That brewery was probably not much more than what most farmers would consider a stock tank, above some kind of a fire. The breweries of the day didn't have they didn't have stainless steel, aluminum products to make their jobs easier and lighter weight systems. They were basically brewing in some kind of a farming operation. And breweries began to emerge where, if you think about it, you needed thirsty people. But they also would emerge where you had water. You had to have sort of a source of agriculture that would grow or supply the barley, the hops. Prior to the 1870s, we didn't really have refrigeration, right? So a lot of what happened is that our breweries emerged in places where they had a source of water, enough water that they could cut ice in the winter, and maybe dig holes in the sides of hills for caves so that they could store their beer. It's not that far-fetched to think when you think about Mineral Point. That's actually where we got our nickname, the Badger State. That's because the miners were digging in those hills looking for lead. And the joke was that all these miners looked like badgers. Thus, the nickname came to be. So it was a great place to sort of begin the industry. But, you know, the people power of Milwaukee was dominant of the day, and it was only a matter of time. John Welsh was the next guy to kind of come along in this string of early breweries, and you had about John, and then you had the Lake Brewery. There were 2 or 3 that sort of emerged in the late 30s, early 40s in Milwaukee. And think about Milwaukee, what I just said to you in terms of what makes Wisconsin such a great beer state. We have an incredible natural resource base from which this industry is based on, right? We have such an abundant clean water supply, the Great Lakes of Milwaukee, ice was prevalent in the winter, you know, an incredible side business of going out and cutting ice to bring into these breweries. Think about our productive soils for growing barley. Hop production was a huge thing for Wisconsin from about 1850 until 1870. In fact, in growing hops, you guys know where Baraboo is in the sort of the south central part of the state? That county, Sauk County, Wisconsin, was the #1 hop producing county in the entire U.S. at the end of the 1860s. That was kind of fueling some of those emerging big breweries like Pabst, Schlitz, and Miller. The other thing that we often forget or maybe overlook is Wisconsin. I know you don't. We take it for granted maybe in the southern part of the state, but it's our forest industry. To this day, Wisconsin is 40% forested. We needed that wood to make the barrels that stored the beer. And then along came our immigration patterns of where the people who settled in Wisconsin were from. And they were from places that beer was part of an existing lifestyle. Germany, Ireland, the European countries, okay? So it only took a few of them to start, particularly the Germans, once they started finding Wisconsin, our rolling topography reminded them of Bavaria. And a few letters home, coupled with somewhat of a quasi-aggressive marketing campaign by the state of Wisconsin to entice Germans to come and live here. We had recruiters in Germany, and we had recruiters near Ellis Island. We were encouraging them to come, just a few letters, that first generation, and boom. By 1860, 25% of Wisconsin's population identified Germany as its native land. And that not only brought folks that were thirsty and understood beer to Wisconsin, but it also brought a whole host of brewmasters, brewery apprentice, brewery workers that had had some kind of experience. But most of all, it was sort of part of the culture. So that was, you know, it's almost like what we would refer to as sort of the perfect storm that made us the beer state early in our statehood. Another thing that happened that was really influential, believe it or not, it was a tragedy, but yet it helped fuel the Wisconsin brewing industry in Milwaukee. 1871, anybody know that date? What happened in 1871 in this region? Well, you're going to think of the Peshtigo Fire, I know. It's the Chicago Fire, okay? The Great Chicago Fire wiped out virtually all of their distilleries and all their brewing industry. And the shrewd marketers like Schlitz and Miller and Pabst, they started putting their beer on schooners to ship their beer down into Chicago. And that fueled not only their production, but it helped them lodge their products in the minds of Chicagoans. So all of that really propelled us to a point with, by the time the mid-1870s had hit, that was the peak in numbers of breweries that were about ready to eclipse today. But we haven't seen those numbers. In the United States, around 1874, 1875, there were 4,000 breweries in the state. In Wisconsin, there were about 225-ish of that number. Today, those numbers, we went through Prohibition, then we were in a consolidated slide down to a place where Wisconsin went from the high point of 225 down to 8 commercial breweries by 1982. Now we're back up on a new slide or a new trajectory. You know, you're hearing a lot in the news, you're hearing a lot in travel guides about the microbrewery, the craft beer movement. So today in Wisconsin, depending upon how you define a brewery, we're probably somewhere around 110 to 120. It's a loose definition because it's easy when you see a commercial brewery. They actually have bottles and cans and they're producing and they're distributing it. The brew pub is another model that is really a more recent model that emerged out of the 1980s. But now today, in the last 5 to 10 years or so, contract brewing is a big thing. Black River Falls, Sand Creek Brewery, most of the beer that it makes is produced under contract for other people who want them to make a beer and put that label on it and help them distribute it. Okay? Have a contract. And then the fun thing that makes this idea I started with, this travel, I want to go and find these places, this new model that we refer to with a twinkle in our eye called the nano brewery. Get it? Macro is Miller. Micro would be the Capital and New Glarus of our day, and now we have the teeny weeny ones called the nano breweries. And these are guys that are, for all practical purposes, they're homebrew folks that really were excited, and they wanted to, you know, either put one in, or they've talked to an owner of a tavern to put a little brew pub or a little brewery in the back room. And so they might not be much bigger than a 5 or 10 gallon homebrew piece of equipment, and they're making house beers. And those are fun when you stumble across those in different restaurants, different cities. They can be really good beer, they can be really bad beer sometimes. But it makes the game of scavenger hunting just a lot of fun. At any time you want to, you know, stop me and, you know, fire a question, we'll do that. We've got some fun that we're going to do here. Ryan's going to join me in a few minutes, and we're going to lead you on a little bit of a tasting exercise so that you can begin to, I know I got a lot of drinking professionals here, but you can begin to sort of broaden your sphere of what you think of when you look at a beer like I have in front of me. There's this old story about in Milwaukee, Captain Pabst, you know, the Pabst brewing icon. Pabst was one of those early guys that had figured out that he knew that the market was beyond Milwaukee, and he was one of the first big breweries to get into what was called the tied house movement. Tied houses are places that they didn't brew, but they were tied to that brewery. So you went in that saloon or that tavern, and it only served that brewery's beer. And Pabst knew the power of that. And so he went into major cities, primarily New York, and wanted to establish his network of tied houses so that he could just really take over. And so to get his foothold, he decided to bring the mayor of New York out to Milwaukee and take a tour, show him what a great brewery he had in Milwaukee. And on the tour that day, they were walking into the brew house, and the brewmaster, Hans, was standing over the brew kettle, and Captain Pabst turned to Hans and said, I want you to show the mayor, just show him what your medal is. Show him how healthy you are. Hans, grab that fire pail over there, fill it with beer, and drink it for him. So Hans looks over, grabs the fire pail off the wall, goes back around behind one of the big casks, fills it up, kind of shows it to the mayor, and then walks back out of sight. Then comes back in front of the mayor again and decides he's going to fill it up again. And then he stands right in front of the mayor face to face and drinks the second one down. And the mayor was pretty impressed and just kind of nodded and patted him on the back, and they went on the tour. Captain Pabst was heard later. He put his arm around Hans and he said, Hans, I just got to know, what'd you do with the first bucket? Ah, Captain, I just had to know I could do it first. So I can see, talking about beer, you've already had your first time here, all right? So what we'd like to do is to, pause here in a second and walk you through just a couple of really easy style definitions, because beer is one of those great. It's so much like cooking, and it's what excites me about it as a food product. Yes, there's the alcoholic side of it that isn't always that healthy, but for the people who really get into this scavenger hunt game, there are over 90 different styles of beer. Okay, my wine drinkers in the crowd, how many styles of wine are there? I think there's not quite that many. All right? So it makes it fun when you think about all the mutations of the different beers when you walk in a brewery or a brew pub, and you might see a list on the board like here. I think what are there, Ryan, about 6 or 7 that you keep on tap all the time. You probably have a rotating tap or two that kind of come in as seasonals and specials. Little larger establishments, I've been in places where they might have a core set of beers, as many as 15, and they might have another 15 different styles on top of that. So you're not going to go into this place and drink 15 pints. Not even I could do that. I probably tried, but I won't go there. So what we're going to do for you is pour you small samples. And actually, when you go into a brew pub, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, is that just like wine, you can order a flight of beer. And these are small samples. Get a spectrum so you can see what different color is, what different texture is, what different flavor is all about. Beer is like wine and like a lot of foods. You got 5 basic parameters when you sample a beer. The first thing that I like to do when I get a beer is to smell it. Because as soon as it comes off of that tap, that's when it's the most effervescent. And so beer is made of 4 kind of basic ingredients. You've got hops, you've got barleys or malts that provide the fermentable sugars for the yeast to turn into alcohol, carbon dioxide, which is one of the reasons we like beer, and it's water. So those 4 basic ingredients, and when you tweak and twist and add a little bit of something different, that's how you end up with 80 plus different styles. And it gives it different colors, different aromas, depending on what goes into that process of making it. So you want to grab it when it's first off the tap and smell it. And beer can get its aromatics from the malts, it can get from the hops, sometimes from the yeast, sometimes from other adjuncts or spices that brewmaster may want to add in there, just like cooking. So smell it first, then you take a good look at it. A beer like this, for folks that don't do a lot of traveling and drinking beer, we often have this misunderstanding that a dark beer is a heavy beer, is a high alcohol beer. That's not really, that can be true, but for tonight, don't let that drive your distinction. The dark is going to be a beer that has a lot of malt in it, a lot of fermentable sugars, yes, but it gets that from the malt that went into it. And the malt may be roasted at different degrees, which will give it different levels of darkness. Okay? So sight, is it dark? Is it light? Is it clear? Is it cloudy? Look at that wonderful creamy head. You wouldn't believe the science that businesses like Miller and Anheuser-Busch have put the dollars in science to create or to reduce the head on your beer. If you think about it, I mean, it's amazing that what goes into what they call head retention, how long a beer's head lasts, what color it is, because a lot of people will look at that and they'll say, well, that might make a difference whether or not I'm going to drink it. Okay? So that's the visual characteristics. Then when you get it and you get to sample a beer, beers can be light on the tongue, they can be heavy on the tongue, just like wines. So is a beer, is it light or heavy? Is it warm? Is it sharp? Is it rough? Those are the kinds of things to think about as it sort of rolls around in your mouth a little bit. And then you get to swallow, and then what's that initial taste like? Beers get their sweetness generally from malts. You're not drinking a cola by any means, but the fermentable sugars will lend some caramel or chocolate roasted kinds of tones to it. That's the main body. So it's either going to be sweet or it's probably going to be bitter in the basic distinctions. The bitter comes from the hops. Hops were somewhat a recent invention to beer when you think about how old a beverage beer is. Hops were determined that they could help preserve a beer. A lot of alpha acids in it. Yeah, it does cut down on some of the ability for bacteria and other things to grow, but it also, the more hops you put in, the more bitter it is, and that bitterness overshadows a lot of things. So in today's world, what we call hopheads, these are people that crave the biggest, boldest, most in-your-face bitter beer that you can imagine. Beers that are so bitter, they suck the moisture out of your mouth and leave sweaters on your teeth. I'm a malt guy, by the way, all right? Then the finish of the beer is that fifth quality, and that's that aftertaste. You're going to get a sample of a lighter beer that's a wheat-based beer that's probably pretty clean, doesn't have a lot of finish in the end. It means it sort of stops fairly quick, and you don't get this lingering aftertaste. Those really bitter, intense beers that I was telling you about, those will linger on. The more hops you put in, you can actually sort of stain the palate. It really screws up a good meal sometimes, I tell you. Because it really does linger on the palate. Malty beers can do the same thing when they're super sweet and super high alcohol. Alcohol is something to be aware of. I always, when I'm sitting across the bar, that's probably the second or third question I'm going to ask somebody is, how strong a beer is this? Because I like to sample, and I don't want to, I'm not sampling pints by any means. So you got to be kind of aware of your own limitations. But you will be able to, if you can taste alcohol, that beer is probably not really where it should be. Alcohol, once you get up into the tasting realm, it's pretty high. So you're probably well in excess of the 10% range. You're up into the wine kind of category if you start tasting wine. But you can sense, tasting alcohol. But you can sense alcohol in a lot of high alcohol beers because there's a warmth to the finish, where you feel a little flush kind of thing, That's that alcohol kicking in. Most beers that you have over a brew pub are going to be somewhere between 4 and 6%. Specialty beers, this time of year, we're easing into the colder days of winter. So they like to roll out the heavier, bigger malty beers, don't you, Ryan? This time of year, I love, this is a porter. This is my kind of gateway into fall. Oktoberfests are another one. Leinie's Oktoberfest is out right now. Oso's is here on tap. That wonderful fall celebratory lager from the Germans. That's a great fall beer. As you get a little later into the season, then we start talking about stouts and barley wines. There's nothing better sitting here looking out over the lake watching a snowfall with a big heavy barley wine. Hint, hint, Ryan, can you make that happen this year? I remember telling somebody that I was passing through here, and I just had the gall to call them once and on my cell phone and say, yeah, I've got one of the porters right now. It's starting to snow, and it's just getting really, really, really bad. I think I'm going to have to stay the night. I was clicking my photos and snow coming in and watching the snowmobilers whiz up and across the ice. Those are the kinds of experiences that make the perfect pint for me, by the way. Ryan, why don't you kind of come and introduce a couple of beers? Maybe tell us just a little bit more about the brewery here. I think all of you that are local know quite a bit about the story already, but it might be good just to sort of remind folks that this is a sort of a second generation brew pub. When I first started coming here, it was under the original brew pub, and then you had that fire that it set kind of dormant for a while, and then things have really taken off again. But we'll go from there to moving into the tasting. Okay?
Sounds good. Thanks for coming, everyone. We just trade up our lightest, which is our Whitey's Wheat Ale. It's definitely not hopped up. It pleases the Miller and Bud drinkers, to put it bluntly. That was the toughest beer, by the way, when I started brewing here 9 years ago. That was the toughest beer to get dialed in. Everyone just wanted it lighter. Make it lighter, make it lighter. So we got that in glasses. We have the porter, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. You're going to have a lot of roasted and chocolate notes in there. So we got those two. We make a red ale here, which is the biggest pain in the butt to make because of the grain bill. We use, for our size system, we use double the amount, a little over double the amount of malt in that beer than we do the pale ale. It's a real manual operation we got here, so you're carrying all the 50-pound bags of malt up here, stirring them in the mash tun. Yeah, and that one, you get a workout stirring that one. It's about 800 pounds, for a 7-barrel, we do about 200 gallons a batch here. So that one, and then the one I like making the most, because it's the easiest, is the pale ale. That one's real light on the body, but everything in that beer comes from the hops. You got your, from the mash tun. This is going to be hard for some of you that don't understand the terms, but the mash tun is the vat that we pour all the malt in, soak the malt at a certain temperature for a certain amount of time to make sure all the sugars are extracted. And then from there we go into the boil kettle. The boil kettle is where we're gonna bring it up to a boil, and once it's boiling, that's where the hop additions start. At the first, as soon as the boil starts, you're gonna do your first hop, which is your bittering hop. All my boils here generally are 60-minute boils, so I'll boil them for 60 minutes total, but the aroma hops go in the last 5 minutes. Pretty much just long enough to make sure nothing's getting carried in there that could live to affect the beer and the fermenter is the bottom line. Cleanliness is 90% of what we do. All the hoses and tanks, everything has a 3-step process of cleaning. So yeah, brew days are definitely the funner part of the job, and then the rest of the time is strictly cleaning. We do a brown ale here that's going to be almost as dark as the porter, but you're not going to have those real roasted notes in it. It's going to be actually fairly mild to drink. Let's see, I cover the Whitey's wheat. We do a wild rice lager. That one we've been out of since the beginning of August. Lagers and ales, the differences between those are pretty much strictly the yeast you use. I mean, there's hundreds of ale yeast and lager yeasts out there. Fermentation time. Lagers, ferment at 55, 60 degrees. Ales are 70 to 75 degrees. Thus, the ales, when we transfer an ale into the fermenter, usually we'll come in the next day, and if it's the red, for instance, which is up there on alcohol, up there on sugar levels, it's blowing chunks all over the floor. We put a escape tube, out of the fermenters with sanitizers, so gases can be released throughout fermentation, but nothing can get sucked in. The lagers might take 3-4 days to even see any activity. But yeah, the lagers are a month in the fermenter. Ales, I've turned ales over 7 to 10 days. That's rushing it, but it's fermented out, and you get your flavors you're looking for.
Sweet. Get them to go and grab a beer.
Yeah, we do have porter and wheat sampled up for if you want to do the lightest and darkest thing. David would be more than willing to get you a sample. If you're wondering what the hoppy end of things are, try the pale ale. It'll make you pucker up. Or the red. The red's really malty. We're pushing 8% on our red, so it's higher alcohol. You can get the caramely, sweeter notes out of the red ale.
So why don't, if you'd like, go grab a sample. We're just going to pause here for a moment for those of you who would like to either refill or grab a sample, and then we're going to kind of resume a little bit of this with a little bit more of the Beer 101. And there'll be plenty of time for you to ask and fire off a few questions if you'd like for either one of us. We understand that if you do have timing issues, don't be shy. We understand that some folks may want to tactfully head toward the door. We hope not, but if you need to, go ahead. So grab a quick beer. We're going to pause for a couple of minutes, and then we'll resume. To go to it, I never get you back.
I'm sorry, the mic was off.
Come on back, everybody. I figured I might lose you. The other thing that happens is the conversations begin to ratchet up a little bit, little higher level of ambient noise for the speaker. So come on back, and we're going to kind of walk you through a little bit more of the beer styles. Okay, you guys all ready to resume? Okay. A minute ago, Ryan was talking about ales and lagers. Okay. Think of ales and lagers as in the natural science world as a dichotomous tree. You got a fork in the road, if you will. Ales are the traditional form of beer that goes back centuries. Lagers are really a recent invention that have been tied to mechanical refrigeration because, as what Ryan was describing, they require colder temperatures and greater control for the environment that the yeast operates in. So we had lagers that were made before we had large refrigerators in breweries, but that's where the ice became so important and caves became so important because we tried to maintain that constant temperature that's somewhat low. So lagers really didn't explode on the scene probably until maybe from 1880 until today. And then when we saw the age of, really the true age of brewery industrialization happened about the time of World War II. when we saw changes in the ways breweries were designed because of packaging. That's when cans really became the standard way that big breweries were going to cater to the home consumption market. And so you had large breweries that really began to think about large-scale production, and we turned our breweries from these quaint, small, local breweries into factories, into almost like, petroleum refineries. Some people would argue that some breweries taste like petroleum refineries, but we won't name names, will we? So think about the ales and the lagers are a dichotomous tree. The lagers are on one side. They're cleaner. They're a little crisper. These are where the big breweries have really made their mark. Miller, Pabst, Budweiser, those brands that became iconic, that really made Wisconsin part of the beer state, were lagers. They found that, the more kind of industrialized approach to brewing, the greater control. I mean, this is really where science kind of comes in. When you think about every time whether you like the beer or not, every time you open a can of Miller or Budweiser, the two biggest breweries in the country, every time you open it, it's exactly the same, isn't it? And think about that. They're making those beers at different locations across the country. It's no longer just made in Milwaukee or St. Louis. It's an incredible amount of environmental engineering and environmental control that goes into that beer. On the other side of the token are the ales, and these are the porters and the stouts, the browns. A lot of brew pubs do ales because it doesn't quite require the commitment to locking a beer up in a fermenter at a certain temperature for maybe a week or two longer than it would with an ale, so you can move them through your system faster. But what's really fun about ales from a beer geek is that you get such a wonderful range of great flavors and colors. The porters and the stouts to the wheat beer that you might have had sampling. It's just it's the older style of beer. There's more prevalence of some fruitiness to them. They're not huge lingering dirty aftertaste, but they have some really fun things that go on. Where the lagers are just simply, when you think about a Pilsner is what it is. It's right there on your tongue right off the bat, and there's not much in the finish. It's just a crisp, clean, bubbly, effervescent, bubbly beer. There are some other mutations here that we can talk a little bit more about if you're curious. There are offshoots of the lager style that the Germans have given us, like the traditional Bock beer and the Doppelbock. Those wonderful seasonal beers that, we're famous in Wisconsin in terms of our German heritage, and we continue to see some seasonal release of the Bock and the Doppelbock, but that really has kind of died away in the more modern microbrewery movement. Probably muddying the... Maibocks are another lager. Yeah. So those of you who sampled the wheat beer, kind of raise your hand glass or something. Let's do a quick... Oh, nah. All right. How about on the darker side, the porter? How many sampled that one? Porter drinkers. Porter. Okay. Anybody grab a pale ale or maybe earlier tonight? Okay. Those are kind of the three pieces of the spectrum I think that Ryan and I would like for you to think about. The wheat beer is really something the Germans kind of helped us get acquainted to. Wheat beers are they're a lighter beer. They can compete over in a micro brew pub with the bigger breweries because they're light-bodied. They're fairly bubbly. Wheat beers have often I'm not sure if you're doing this, but wheat beers often have a certain kind of yeast that will give you these wonderful banana and clove flavors. Anybody pick that up in the wheat? Those would be kind of lingering in the background a little bit.
We do a Hefeweizen here for a seasonal, which for that you're using a German style yeast, which really you get a lot of that banana in the finish. And
I like to think that a good Hefeweizen, you get a sense of a bubble gum, a really assertive one, and that's a good thing in a Hefeweizen. All right. On the other side, on color-wise, is the porter. That one. Did you get a little bit of that roastedness, a little bit of chocolate, kind of roasted chocolate? That's the backbone of this beer, right?
It is. Yep.
Porters are a great a beer in history. They are beers that emerged from the 1700s, they really were the beer of the working class. They got their name from the porters of London because they were the choice of beer by the working class porters. They were probably the cheaper beer. They weren't the really effervescent champagne-like beers that you paid a premium for. So they got to be so popular with the porters that that's how they became named for the porter. The stout that we have is really a step up from the porter. Stouts in this country, well, worldwide actually, when you think of a stout, what do you think of? Guinness, yes. Guinness has so defined what we think of in a stout that that's both good and bad, is that there are really 4 or 5 different types of stouts, but everybody thinks of Guinness first because it's such a dominant presence, and also the way it's marketed. Guinness has a very distinctive tap handle, and it has that wonderful creamy, almost like ice cream head, right? Those of you who've traveled to Ireland, you ever have them put the clover in the top of the glass? All right, it's kind of cute, but it's kind of fun too if you're all the way in Ireland. So stouts sort of were the graduated up. They were the little higher, bolder version of the porter, and they were made famous by Arthur Guinness. Stouts, as they arose out of Ireland and Dublin, they were made with extremely soft water, and that gave that beer an incredible softness in and of itself. Today, when you get a Guinness, the softness is not necessarily the water as much as they're goosing it a little bit with nitrogen. If you think about your basic chemistry, a beer that's on carbon dioxide is different than a beer served on nitrogen. Most beers are all pushed probably by carbon dioxide, and those have bigger bubbles. So it's a crisper, it's a rougher feeling on your mouth or in your palate. Where when a beer is pushed by nitrogen, it's soft and it's creamy, and it leaves a wonderful soft head. And so what brewers and servers will sometimes do is, it doesn't have to be a stout. You can have a porter that's put on a nitrogen tap line, and it can be quite special when you find it.
It's a totally different beer.
Yeah, it really is.
It is.
Yep. So that's how texture can actually drive the experience. Temperature can drive the experience as well. Beers that are really cold, they will accentuate that hoppiness. As opposed to a beer like this, I think porters actually, for my liking, that's why I've left it here a little bit longer. I like them to kind of come down in temperature, because the warmer it gets, the more of those roasted caramel tones will come out in the flavor. The English like to serve their beers at cellar temperature, sort of, I think it's hard to beat a nice English porter, in a pub. That's pretty much true no matter what the color is that the warmer the beer will get, it'll bring out more of its sweetness. And the colder it is, it'll accentuate the hops. I really think a combination of really cold beers and those that have been really goosed with CO2, they hide a lot of the flaws of a beer. Because those bubbles on your tongue, you think you've got a really sharp or really hoppy beer, and you can't sometimes taste what's behind it. New Glarus, you guys are familiar with New Glarus, right? They make a beer called Totally Naked, okay? Go ahead, laugh, get it over the name, all right? But the reason they came up with that beer is that it's simply a golden ale. And there's nothing there, it doesn't hide anything. It's clean, it's not a Pilsner with a lot of hops. It's just a nice, solid, semi-malty golden lager with nothing to hide. And so they named it Totally Naked. So let's see, the other third one, I think we said pale ale. Pale ale, some of you may have tasted that. Your pale ale is made with what kind of hops?
The bittering hops, I use Northern Brewer, and then the dry hop is Cascade, and the Roma hop is Cascade, but that's the only beer here that I dry hop as well, which means after fermentation, I'll pour more hops in the fermenter.
Okay, so you're taking that bitter side of this beer, and he's finding different ways to not only smell it initially, but to taste it, and then even that lingering after experience that you get that might be a combination of both the palate, the aftertaste, and the aromatics. The beer geeks love to play a game of, what's the hop in my beer? There are people, I can't do this, but there are people that can just basically grab the beer, taste it. Oh, that's got Mosaic. That's got Simcoe, you know.
Or malts.
Or well, malts.
I know
yeah.
some brewers that can pick what malts you use in a beer.
So if you're doing this at home some night with your spouse, you've lost it, folks. All right. You know, I'm going to open it up here for some questions, but some other recent trends. If you think about where we're at in terms of the rise of the craft beer industry today, like I said earlier, the craft beer industries, we just exceeded 2,800 breweries across the country. And those are a lot of different sizes. Now, craft beer, when you hear that term, this is partly marketing, but it's also a segment of the industry trying to distinguish itself. Craft beer does not include the Millers and the Budweisers, okay? The craft beer, the Brewers Association has come out with a very specific definition that's in part based on size, how many barrels they produce a year, what percent ownership of that company belongs to a bigger company, and also I believe what malt flagship or what, no, their primary beer has to be a malt fermentable sugar-based beverage. In other words, it couldn't be a Bud Lime, something that's been flavored. All right, so they've made these specific definitions that say, really, if you're a small brewer, you're in the craft beer club. But if you're making 10 million barrels a year, you're over here in the Miller Budweiser guys. All right. So, for example, how does this play out in Wisconsin? Leinenkugel's, longtime family, a lot of history. You know, all of us take great pride being Wisconsinites in saying Leinenkugel's, but Leinenkugel's is not a craft brewery because it's owned primarily by Miller. That has a lot of ramifications in the club, so to speak, in how they promote themselves, how they market themselves as a group of craft beer people. When I started writing the books, the term was really microbrews or microbreweries. And that term really isn't used in today's world. It's craft beer, okay? So the craft beer segment, if you think about all the beer that's sold, the craft beer segment today only represents about 7% of all the beer, you know? So that means that, you know, 9 out of 10 beers are still the big guys. But what's happening in terms of the market and what the buyers are finding is that overall in this country over the past 10 years, beer consumption has been going down. Overall beer consumption. So we're drinking less beer as Americans. But what we're seeing is slow, steady growth in the craft beer movement. So likely what's happening, if you kind of follow my little bit of science logic here, is that we're seeing the modern craft beer drinker sort of trading up, okay? Overall, consumption is going down, but this segment of craft beer, the guys that frequent here, that beer is becoming a bigger chunk of the segment, or a bigger chunk of the overall beer sales. It's still a very small chunk overall of beer. But to give you an idea, if you think about this, Miller in Milwaukee, I think last year their production was probably around 10 million barrels, okay? Overall, Miller Brewing in the United States, Miller SAB, they produce somewhere, rough big numbers, about 105 million barrels nationally, okay? A barrel is 31 gallons? Yes. All right, and it weighs a lot when you're moving it by yourself, right? So that's on the big side of things. To be a craft beer maker, you're making less than 6 million barrels, and there's really not many in the club between about 500,000 and 6 million. You're really talking Sam Adams. That's kind of the Sam Adams rule, is they push that number at 6 million so Sam could get in the club. So most of the guys are lower, but the analogy here is Miller is 105 million barrels. Budweiser is about twice that in the United States. The smallest brewery in Wisconsin, right now, it made 61 barrels of beer last year. That's a nano, okay? You know, that is a big contrast. That's what's really fascinating about Wisconsin and its beer heritage, is that you still have Miller and its big plant in Milwaukee, but then you have the craft beer commercial breweries like New Glarus, which is our largest craft beer maker in Wisconsin, but you still have the Stevens Points. You still have Lakefront. All of those are in place. You still have, though that cluster of folks, and then you get into the brew pub game, and the brew pubs range from about 10,000 barrels a year all the way down to maybe 200 to 300. And then you have this smaller emerging group called the nanos. Brew pubs and breweries in Wisconsin have the craft beer segment. Another thing that really makes us special, I believe, is that of this 100 plus breweries, properties that I talked about, it's almost split down the middle between brew pubs and commercial breweries. So we have about half and half. It's probably going more the route of the brew pub when you start lumping in the emerging nanos today. But that was much different. When I wrote my Illinois book, it was almost all a brew pub industry driven in Illinois. It still is predominantly brew pub driven. Minnesota is just a hotbed of brewery activity these days. They're a little more like Wisconsin. There's still a healthy brewery and brew pub kind of combination, but the way the state laws in Minnesota work, there's probably been a propensity to have a few more commercial breweries. They did some things they couldn't for a long time in Minnesota. They couldn't sell a pint of beer at the brewery. That's almost sacrilege in Wisconsin, right? You can't get a beer at the brewery. Once they passed their pint law, that freed up a lot of the things that you're seeing happen in Minnesota. So you've seen the numbers go from about 10 microbreweries in 2006 to something like 60 today. When I wrote my Minnesota book, I had it written, I had it put to bed in 2009, and I told the publisher, we got to wait and see what's going to happen with this pint law. And we pulled it back off the presses, and we waited for a year to let this thing see what it was going to do. And so I had a relatively small book at that time until where it's almost as thick as the Wisconsin book is today. And I think you're going to see, just like Wisconsin, it's really taking off. It's fun to be a beer drinker in the Midwest. Some of you have asked questions about travel and tourism. That's a big deal in today's craft beer world. Travel by way of the beer glass is what I call it. And it starts, like I said earlier. I mean, I want to find these places, and so that takes me into a town I may not have been before. I mean, I think about the first time I went to your brewery in now it escapes me. Marinette, for example. I'm not sure when I would have gone to Marinette other than to kind of find my way up to the UP, but I went there looking for the rail house, and that created this wonderful experience. I ended up spending 3 or 4 days in Marinette just to join the town, Now, extrapolate that to, it's not just Wisconsin or the Midwest, folks. There are wonderful beer places and venues that if you love, this kind of exploring, getting to meet people. Portland, Oregon, for example, it's Oregon is the #1 state for craft beer, and Portland is the #1 city. To give you an idea, the craft beer, it's in Madison is sort of, in some ways, pardon, I know there's a little bit of bias toward the southern part of the state here, but Madison has a certain kind of a fervor over craft beer that's unlike other cities in Wisconsin. About when you go into a tavern in Madison, there's a good chance that 7 out of 10 taps, whether it's a brewery or not, in a tavern, folks, 7 out of 10 taps are local Wisconsin-made beers. That's huge, okay? Considering the pressure that I just told you earlier about how much segment that Miller and Budweiser control. Okay, so the saturation in a market like Madison is somewhere about, actually it's about 28 to 30% of the beers being sold in Madison are craft beers compared to the 7% nationally. In a city like Portland, Oregon, that's closer to 45 to 50%. It's a huge haven for people who love local craft beer. Seattle is another city like that. San Diego, believe it or not. Vermont, Burlington. This time of year, you want a pretty place to go and drink beer? Go to Vermont, go to Burlington. Great local food movement, great food, a lot of great scenery there, and just a haven of local breweries. Festivals are another thing that has gotten to be a pretty big deal in the beer culture world. People wanting to find a festival and go to it. Not quite like, well, Oktoberfest in Germany is definitely a festival that you can go to, but these are things like the Great Taste of the Midwest in Madison. This is the one Saturday every year. They limit it to 6,000 tickets, and it's gotten to be like a rock concert where you have to camp out overnight to get tickets. 6,000. But what's fascinating is that that festival now has expanded itself to where the entire week leading up to the festival, restaurants in Madison have gotten into the game and offer specials and special tappings. Breweries are releasing special beers through those restaurants ahead of the Great Taste Festival. Breweries that aren't allowed to actually display at the festival, like from California, Stone, Lagunitas, they come into Madison that week ahead, and they will go to a restaurant and do a special tapping, even though they aren't even at the festival. The Mecca right now is going on right now in Denver, the Great American Beer Festival. Some of you may have heard about that. The convention center is sold out for the next 3-4 days. 50,000 people descend on Denver for the Great American Beer Festival. There are 4 public sessions. The Great American Beer Festival also gives out awards. So breweries from all over the country can submit their beer literally weeks ahead of time, and it's judged competitively against each other. And then they're giving out medals. That's probably the premier festival that a lot of the beer folks sort of gravitate to, but it makes a wonderful reason to go to Denver, right? Why don't we just sort of take a few questions?
Just before we start the questions, I want to remind people who are watching from home or are watching at the library that they can type in questions, and we will receive them here, and we will ask your questions for you. Carol, raise your hand, has the microphone, and she's going to run it around so that everybody can ask questions.
I was just curious, Ryan, how do you start with a new beer? Do you start in a very small batch? And what is your protocol?
I really haven't made a homebrew size batch for a new special just because I don't have the equipment at my house. But that, and I'm spoiled with this equipment. I mean, it's so easy being able to control my fermenter temperature, my mash temperature, and then having the cooler room and having, be able to keg it up here. I do. I've never made a partial batch. Generally, I'll play it safe, on the first batch. The flavor profiles I'm looking for might be real subtle and not where I really want them, but a lot of it's trial and error. Like, let's say we do a chocolate oatmeal stout here. That was a recipe we came up with a few years back, and I pretty much looked at my porter recipe. They're both ales. I use the same yeast for them. They're both darker. They're both, heavier in the roasted and chocolate flavors. So I based that stout recipe off of my porter recipe. I grew off of the porter recipe to get the stout. So that's pretty much what I do. The honey cranberry ale, that was pulled off of our wheat ale recipe, and just souped up a little more.
I have a question about cask beer, C-A-S-K beer. It's more popular in Europe, right? But is it predominant, or is it starting to happen here?
Yeah, it's often what we think of is cask beer, cellar temperature beers. Cask beers are served a little warmer. They're uncarbonated. There's kind of an acquired taste, I think, in this country. We're not quite as accustomed as the British are to them. However, it is in breweries, particularly in brew pubs, what you'll see in larger brew pubs, you will see a cask beer program where very few brew pubs in the U.S. will dedicate themselves to strictly serving cask beers, but they might have 1 or 2 behind the bar. For example, if you go into Great Dane in Madison, they have a roll of casks or kegs that are behind the bar, and they'll have 1 or 2 styles. Sometimes you're lucky enough that you can have the same style served pushed with CO2 or nitrogen, and you can try it also on the warmer cask side of it. Cask ales can come in a lot of any style. Really could be cask made. but it's usually the distinguishing features. It's not going to be fizzy. It's not going to be bubbly. Oftentimes we see the bigger, bolder beers in cask, particularly in brew pubs. So you'll see some barley wines in cask conditions. You'll see beers that are bourbon barrel aged. They may not be served in the cast cellar temperature as much as they were fermented in an old bourbon barrel to get a little bit of that bourbony sweetness going with them. That's probably the more common way we see it in this country, is something that has been fermented in a barrel, but then it's been finished carbonated like every other beer. So they're seeking the flavor of what was ever in that cask to get into the beer. You think about this, I mean, you could take a Chardonnay barrel and put a wonderful rich brown ale in it and have a completely different experience than if you took the same beer and you put that in a bourbon barrel. It would impart some really fun, funky flavors. So, did I do that okay?
Yeah. I've been traveling around. My car stops at every brewery.
Yeah, I've had that problem too. Yeah.
And I've been seeing these session ales, session beers. What's going on in the brewing industry? What are we doing with these session beers?
Well, session is a term, again, we sort of got from the English and the Irish. Session is basically a low alcohol beer that you can drink more than one at a drinking session.
It's good for my car.
Hey, good for your car. Well, absolutely. They're beers that are probably, I think that the technical definition is something less than 4%, or maybe it's 4.2%. But it's a beer that's designed to be a beer that's sessionable. You drink more than one at a given setting. And oftentimes they're on the lighter side, they're on the golden side. It doesn't necessarily mean you can make a low alcohol dark beer, but if they say session on it, it usually means low alcohol. Right. You okay? Near beer? Near beer is not real. I mean, there's a little bit out there in the marketplace. Near beer is something like 2.78. It has to be that or lower. Near beer. Session beer can have more alcohol in it than near beer. Yeah.
Ryan, your wild rice is wonderful. Thank you so much. Could you?
It should be back. I'm hoping early to mid-November.
That's good, because I'm in severe withdrawal.
I know. So am I.
Could you talk a little bit about the process?
As far as the lager goes,
Please.
The wild rice.
Yes.
Yes. That's an interesting grain bill on the fact that, the majority of all my recipes, you have your base malt, which is the majority of the malt you use in that. Your color, your sweetness is going to come from your specialty malts. That I use 50% specialty, 50% base. I boil down, oh boy, what's the poundage? I want to say it's 20 pounds of wild rice. I boil that down ahead of time, pretty much till it's edible, and then I throw that in with all the malt right in the mash tun. This next batch I'm going to be doing, I switched wild rice this time, so I'm a little skeptical on how this next one's going to turn out. I used a wood roasted wild rice that I got from Minnesota, the past handful of years, which was a huge plus in that beer. It gave it a real nutty finish, a lot of earthy tones in the finish. This new rice, I don't know, looks the same, but we'll see.
Ryan's a little humble. That beer that you guys are known for here has inspired a lot of other wild rice beers, like the one that's made a little bit more in a Capital Brewery, or was being made at Capital Brewery. Wild rice at Barley John's in Minnesota, New Brighton. This has been congratulations.
I just got a call a couple of weeks ago from Kevin down in Wausau at Red Eye. He's trying out a wild rice. So he just wanted to pick my brain kind of on where I added it, how I used it. That beer, that was an award winner in Colorado for the original brewmaster here, Rick Meyer. He now works for Summit, I believe. He won a gold medal with that. And the only thing I switched in that beer is the yeast and the type of rice that I was using. Otherwise, the grain bill is all the same in that one.
Mine is a double question. You talked about how you experiment with different brews. I was at the Sam Adams Brewery for a tour last year, and they said before every batch is bottled, they have a person who actually taste tests the beer to make certain that it's good. How much taste testing do you do? And I always heard, I don't know if it's true or not, that if you bottle a beer in brown glass, it's better than if you bottle it in clear glass. I don't know if you have experience with that because your beer is here and you sell the beer in growlers. Any thoughts would be helpful.
Tasting, I don't do nearly the amount that I did the first year or two that we were open here. Gets old after a while, trust me. I do a few tests. You know, we're doing gravity tests, which is your test that you do for your sugar levels throughout the whole process of getting into the fermenter. And then, yeah, a lot of it's so second nature to me now where I can tell when the fermentation process is winding down. Yeah, and it really, recipe, your timings, your temperatures, if all that stayed the same and you're reaching your target gravity for fermentation, if all your vats and hoses were clean, you're not going to pick up any off flavors in there. So, yeah, they'll be consistent.
Your question about glassware, yeah, one of the biggest enemies to beer and how long it lasts, light and oxygen. So that's how the brown bottle really came to be, is that it reduces the amount of light that goes in. That'll make a beer skunky just about as quick as anything. Clear bottles that you see like Miller, champagne and beer, those are beers that if you pasteurize a beer, you're basically stopping the biological activity in it, and you can get away with that. And also, that was a marketing plan for Miller's. They wanted it to look effervescent, sparkle, golden like champagne. So they put that into the clear bottle. But by and large, the craft beer movement has really gone to the brown bottles because of the light. The ultimate, I think most brewers are now beginning to realize, is we're probably entering a phase where we're going to see a lot more cans. That cans are really the most stable package for beer. And we all have that kind of that little bit of twinge, right, about a can and thinking about the 60s, 70s, about that metallic kind of thing that went with it, all right? We've kind of gotten a little bit beyond that in our can technology now, but cans are making a huge comeback. Breweries are really thinking more about putting can lines in than they are bottling lines in today. There's a mobile can operation that actually drives around Wisconsin on packaging day. You make an appointment with the guy. He brings his mobile canning operation here to your shop, sets it up, and you run your beer into the cans. It's all done right there on the spot that day. But new breweries like Potosi, they're going to put a canning operation in their new expansion project in Potosi. Wisconsin Dells Brewing they just invested in a canning operation. It's stable. It gives them some ability to actually do some things, labeling and marketing, that you can't always do with a bottle.
Yeah, cost is a big thing too. It's so much easier to get your labels screened onto cans versus getting the paper label, for a bottle.
Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
The non-alcoholic beers, O'Doul's and etc., how do they stack up with taste and all of the things that you're talking about?
Yeah. My first quip is non-alcoholic. What's the point? After you get beyond that, okay. No, they have their place. I don't know the marketing numbers for them, but my guess is that there really aren't very many breweries that produce non-alcoholic beers, and it's the big guys. The challenge is that it's a fairly sophisticated process to strip the alcohol back out of the beer and keep the flavor. So that's why you see, Sharps and a few of those that have their ties back to Miller and Budweiser, and they would be considered probably, if you looked at the numbers, those numbers would be probably thrown over into the macro camp. So I don't know how to describe what section of the market it is, but there is a market for it, and it's a little like the gluten-free movement now, and the organic as well. I suspect that non-alcoholic beers, at least in the U.S., it's a relatively very small piece, even compared to gluten-free and organic. Gluten-free is they're catching in the movement now. There are emerging companies that are trying to vie for a segment of the gluten-free beer market. Lakefront Brewery in Milwaukee, I think its number 2 seller is their new grist, gluten-free. Yeah, that speaks for itself over there. Let's see.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there are hundreds of wonderful things you can do with the beer, with the hops and with the grains and with the malts and all that kind of stuff. How important is the purity of the water to start the whole process?
Sort of my old field of water. Absolutely. If you think about water, it's 95% of the beer. It really is, depending upon all the other things. But it's going to be about an average of somewhere around 95%. So what you find, different styles have emerged because of different things in the water. I mean, if the water's really bad, yeah, it's going to make a skunky beer. But let's think for a minute about things like how hard or soft the water is. Guinness kind of came to be because the water in Dublin is super soft. The whole style of the pale ale, the India pale ale. The pale ale originated in Britain, in a region of Britain where the water was incredibly hard, had a lot of dissolved solids in it. That accentuates the hop bitterness. And so that region, the pale ale, became known from that region first, and it was in part because of the hops, but also because of the combination of the water with it. Breweries, depending upon size and the ability that they have to invest, they may have a fairly intricate water filtration system, or they may be adding some additives to make it hard or soft. But that comes with a matter of scale and willingness to invest in the brew house and what you have to work with. If your city water is sort of middle of the road, you're probably ideal. But if you've got, water that's super soft, and you're going to be a pale ale brewery, you might be throwing something in that to help sort of balance that out a little bit. Or vice versa. If you've got really hard water, super hard water around the brew house, that's probably overall not a great thing to do for cleanup and all that other stuff.
I agree.
So. Well, think about it. If your water's really hard, it's the same thing as what happens in your shower at home. Stains everything. Yeah. But the hardness, hard water will actually accentuate some styles like those based on hops. But if it's really, really super hard, then, you're going to have other problems around the brewery that go with that. I don't know the chemistry well enough, but I suspect also what's in that water creating the environment for yeast to do its thing. I mean, in some ways, that's what these guys are. They're yeast wranglers, That yeast makes all the difference in the world in a beer. You're creating the environment for the yeast to go out, do their happy thing, multiply, and poop out carbon dioxide. And the better are these guys at it, the better off the beer gets to be. And so how do you create that environment where the yeast will really do their thing? You're a matchmaker, right?
Some breweries also produce root beer. What's the relationship between the two in a brewing situation?
No, I haven't. The original owners here, they did make their root beer. Root beer, from what I understand, it's not a fermented beverage. It's pretty much you got your sugar extract, mix that with so many gallons of water, and carbonate the hell out of it.
You do see a few folks, like Stevens Point, they have a hard root beer out now that they're fermenting that. But breweries, with root beer, my understanding is that breweries, small ones in particular, don't always like to do it because root beer stains everything. So everything from the hoses to the lines, the serving lines, it will just impregnate those lines, and so whatever comes behind it, whether it's a water line or whether it's beer, you'll get that residual sweetness from the sarsaparilla in the root beer. That's one of the reasons why it's a little bit painstaking for the small guys to do it. But on the other hand, you have breweries like Sprecher and Gray's. Sprecher makes more money in their soda line than they do in the beer line. I mean, it's just exactly what Ryan said. You turn on the water and you turn on the flavor additives and, let it set with some CO2 gas behind it for a while, and you're ready to sell. You don't have to wait 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks like you do in a brewery. And so, I think Sprecher is a fascinating example because they have they're almost like a dichotomous business in a way. They have this incredible image for their gourmet sodas. I have relatives in other states, and my nieces always wanted me to bring home Sprecher root beer. They just thought it was better than anything they've ever had. Part of it is the image. I'm sure can't get it anywhere else outside of where they were anyway, and it comes in those wonderful brown big bottles. But it is a sweeter. So I think something to think about is that this business of you see businesses that can make a lot of money on sodas and soft drinks, and some of them happen to be in the beer business as well.
I have a question since I have control of the mic for Ryan. So, we've been talking a couple times about Lakefront Brewery, and they're pretty progressive in a lot of things that they do with renewable products and new grist and local beer. Is that a possibility for Minocqua Brewery to have a local beer, the ingredients coming from local sources?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, anything's possible. I use Breeze, malts, which is out of the state. That's down in Chilton. Hops. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of hops being grown all over the state. I made a harvest ale a few years back that I actually used some hops that we had growing out along our beer garden. Since then, those plants are gone because of the remodeling. But yeah, it was a 1 year. Assistant and I went out with some 5-gallon pails and got a few pails full and added it to the finish of a boil, and yeah, it was great. But it's definitely, you see more and more that there's a lot of hop co-ops going on, especially in the southern part of the state. Malts, to get going on a malt plant or factory. I mean, I don't see one of those opening up in the northern part of the state, but water, that's all right here.
I have a question on hops, since you're talking about that. How did hops come to be added to beer? Beer originally didn't have hops. Who had that brilliant idea? Why? Are there other uses for hops other than beer?
Yes, hops could be a food additive. They really have become tied to the brewing industry. And hops were probably first used, in Belgium and in Germany. And I think the monastery brewing, are probably the ones that are credited most often with sort of discovering their utility in beer. Before hops, your beers would have been seasoned with different kind of spices or herbs. Heather, yarrow were common. If you ever see a beer on a beer board called a groot is the closest thing to what beer would probably have tasted like before hops, because groots are spiced with those other types of heather or yarrow. Hops are, like I said earlier, as the brewing industry caught hold here, we discovered that we could really grow hops really well. And we became a leader in growing hops, primarily because we also had all those big breweries in Milwaukee that were buying them. Then we had problems around 1870 where we had problems with a downy mildew that just sort of that coupled with an overabundance of hops, and that began to, the mildew in particular began to others began to look to where they could grow hops better. And the hop industry has since gravitated to the Pacific Northwest. The Yakima Valley, just outside of Mount Rainier, is where the dominant growth of hops occurs for the U.S. craft beer industry. You're seeing a resurgence of it today in Wisconsin. I think probably what you're seeing are hop fields, hop farmers. These are guys that are coming in and putting anywhere from a half acre to maybe 4 or 5 acres. There are some bigger ones, but what we're finding is that hops are kind of a little bit of a romantic kind of crop in a way. I want to grow it for my local brewer, and I'd love to have a beer with my hops in it. But if you're not willing, if you don't have the investment in the equipment side of it, hops are incredibly labor intensive because you're picking those little flowers off these vines that are 10 to 14 feet long. And if you don't have the mechanization, you're stuck with doing that by hand. And most of the equipment, probably from the from the 1940s through the 1990s, all the equipment for hops and harvesting was actually being made by 2 different manufacturers, both based in Germany. So even if you wanted a mechanical harvester, the place that you would have gotten it would be Bavaria. And so what we're seeing now are these cooperatives coming into the central part of the state or wherever, and the farmers are going together and thinking, well, can we buy a used harvester from Germany? Can we find one? Will they cut it up, ship it over here on a big boat, and then we'll reassemble it? And that's what's happening. There's an industry that's doing that right now. My first trip to Germany about 5 years ago, that was part of the reason I went over with a couple of university folks, is that one, we were looking at hop production at the research institutes, but then we were also looking at implement dealers who had used equipment to try to figure out if there was a market to grab those used machines that weren't being used in Germany, cut them up, bring them over here. And the first one that came to central Wisconsin was one of the machines that I looked at. So it's kind of fun to see that come back. I feel like, chalk that one up for a little bit of an impact that we had in a program that, we were able to sort of connect those interests. And now that's gone on to where there are 3 or 4 of those machines in Wisconsin, and now there's an independent company that has arose in St. Louis that's actually doing what I just did, is to go over and find these machines and then bring them over here for farmers. A hop machine, by the way, if you think about these, what happens is a barn really gets turned into a factory. Hop harvesters really aren't like what you think of as a combine. They're really stationary machines, and so you're cutting these vines that are on really large ginseng trellises, all right? They're 15 feet in the air, and the vines are going straight up. So you cut these vines off, you haul them into your barn, and you feed them into this machine with the knives on it, and they defoliate and clip off the cones. And then the cones are moved elsewhere in the barn so that they can be dried, then that they can either be pelletized or baled, and then there's a storing area. So the barn becomes a factory. And so what we're seeing here is that these machines are kind of coming over here with 4 or 5 farmers who put it back together at a single location, and then these small acreages are feeding that machine. And you were talking about the harvest ale. I had to smile because now's the glory for hop people, for people who love hops in their beers. This is the best time of the year because you're seeing these guys that are going out to the field, and some of them are bringing them directly to Ryan's, and they're making what are called wet hop beers. So they're not drying the hops, they're bringing them in, they're defoliating, deconing them, and they're putting them right into the brew kettle the day they were picked. And it's an incredible, juicy fruit kind of a beer when you do that right. And then we also have the harvest ale is still kind of the same thing with this year's fall harvest. It's the fresh hops, but they're probably brought into the brewery or brought into the processor. They might be dried or they're held a little longer. They're not wet or that fresh. But all of that is happening right now. So for people who love hops, kind of keep your eyes open for those kinds of beers. I think, does Central Waters still do their... They're still doing a fresh hop beer. There's a kind of what Ryan was describing. There was about 5 breweries the last couple years. They all went together and they came out to the fields. Guys like Paul Graham and Randy Sprecher actually came out to the farm, oversaw the harvest, took those hops back in that day, and they all kind of released their version of a fresh hop beer in similar looking packages on the same day. So.
So if we're kind of winding down, a couple of nitpicky things. Ryan, the hops you're growing out here, did those originally come from Mark Flieger?
Come from who? Sorry?
Mark Flieger. If you don't know, that's fine.
I don't know.
Okay. The other one is about Guinness, because I really, really love Guinness Extra Stout in the bottle, and I hate the stuff with nitrogen. What's the huge difference?
Well, the extra stout is in you're right, it's in the bottle, but it has a lot more roasted chocolate malts to it. It's been aged a lot longer. It doesn't have the nitrogen, which is another one, but if I recall right, its alcohol is somewhere around 8%, where Guinness normally, you don't think it is that high? It's a stronger, but it is more roasted, more raw. Yeah. Guinness, I've always felt that Guinness in Ireland is a little bit different than it is here. It's a little richer here. Yeah, there you go. But Guinness is really, it's a misnomer, because just straight Guinness, while it looks rich and thick, it's a very light beer. It's probably around 4% alcohol. And it's easy drinking, it's smooth. Think about it, the Irish, they like to drink, right? But the Irish really, they don't want beer to get in the way of a good conversation. They love it to be part of the table and be part of the topic, but they don't want to sit there till they fall asleep at the table. They love the aspect, it's kind of that proverbial conversation starter, maybe maintainer. So, and Guinness, I think, is just the epitome of that. It's a great session beer for most people. You don't think so? Yeah, I would say that the extra stout is a little hard to be a session beer, though. It's an acquired taste, Yeah.
I have another question too, if I might. I guess this could be for either of you, but back to the wild rice lager. Lagers in general, the way I understand it is lagers are bottom fermenting yeast and ales are top fermenting yeast. Is that
Correct. Yep.
okay? So is that the biggest differentiation, that the wild rice lager takes so long, and what's the process there? How come?
Our wild rice is generally 30 days in the fermenter. It takes longer to get going on the fermentation, and then, like for the ales, when it's all done fermenting, I can pretty much seal the fermenter up, and all my fermenters are double jacketed, so I have total control of my temperatures. I can take them from 73 degrees right down within 6 hours. The whole batch is down to 35. Generally, lagers are, besides taking longer to get going, 2-3 weeks, you still got some activity in the bucket. Instead of crashing that temp right away, generally what I do is I'll drop it 3 to 4 degrees a day, which chews up, that chews up a good week and a half just in that process. Fermentation's pretty much all done. But yeah, I wish I had more fermenters.
Anyone
else? So this one's for Ryan. Back to that wild rice, you said someone called you about the recipe. So if there's only, I'm not sure if this number was correct, around 130 craft brewers in Wisconsin, it's kind of a small little almost fraternity that you guys are in. How forthcoming are you with some of the information to allow people to help replicate what you did?
I think all brewers in the state are the same, where they'll laugh at you if you go up and ask for a recipe. Figure it out yourself type thing. But yeah, we as far as, I think what he wanted out of me was, for one, where do I get my bulk wild rice? And two, at what process do I use it in? When do I add it? How much do I use? Yeah, that was about it.
But
Can I answer that?
You might comment a little bit on how collegial that you are generally as a group of brewers. So, you all help each other problem
we do.
solve.
Yes. Yeah, when I was learning to brew here, there's a local guy that used to brew here. He came in and kind of relearned the system with me. I learned through South Shore is a great help. I apprenticed through, used to be Stone Cellar in Appleton. I know Steve real well. I brewed with them, which was nice because he actually has the same size system down there that I do. If I have a problem getting a hold of a hop or a malt, or I'm having a bacteria issue, on the system, yeah, it's everyone. We're one big family, really. They're more than willing to help me troubleshoot a problem, or they just want me to make a good beer as well.
I'm just curious, as IPA stands for India Pale Ale. How does India get into the Pale Ale?
Well, the India Pale Ale originated in actually Britain. And so it was a beer that sort of, in part, was the hard water thing, but also what they figured out, they wanted to ship beer to the Indies where the British troops were. And so they figured out that if they just hopped the heck out of it, it would withstand those long, hot sea voyages, or at least taste better when it got to where its destination was. And so, lo and behold, they did enough of that when the soldiers came home, they kept asking for that India Pale Ale, and so that sort of arose as a brand related to that. That's the kind of the generally accepted historic way of thinking about the India Pale Ale. The prefix of India Pale Ale is, you get great India Pale Ales here, but something also to sort of look at is we transpose that sometimes and say American Pale Ale or American India Pale Ale. And that's a reflection that the Americans like aggressive everything. So, you know, an American version of an India Pale Ale is going to be a lot more aggressive than the British version of the IPA. And it's usually that connotation of using the prefix American means that all or most of the ingredients, such as hops, are American. So that gets us the American label, and by virtue of that, the modern craft beer brewers they know that there is a market out there called hopheads, and they're gonna speak to that with their hops.
Any more questions? Okay.
There is a local homebrew club that meets here at Minocqua Brewing Company the second Thursday of the month, and it's a great group of people that are interested in home brewing, and anybody's welcome to attend.
Just let me add to that, those of you who love to travel, she just reminded me of one of the best tips that I can give you is when you're traveling to a city and you don't have a lot of plans, but you want to know where to go drink good beer, call the local homebrew supply store and say, where do you drink? You know, it'll get you, it'll get you into some fun places, but it usually will get you into some really good beer. I've also gone into cities where I fished around to figure out where does the local homebrew club meet, and those also can be, if you're traveling by yourself, it's kind of hard to bring my wife into a homebrew meeting, but talk about some great experiences in terms of discovering the local nature of beer. I was I'll finish with this little bit of a travel tale for you. I flew up to Anchorage several years ago, and I did my trick with the local homebrew store about, well, where do you go for a good beer? And they said, well, you're really fortunate because tonight there's a beer tasting at this restaurant called Humpy's. Anybody been to Anchorage? Humpy's is a big seafood legendary place, but the guys were coming up from Juneau with Anchorage or Alaskan Brewing, and they were bringing these special lateral samples of their Alaskan smoked porter, which is sold by vintage, okay? So you're not just buying this year's batch, you might be able to get to sample 5 years in consecutive order, okay? So I'm going, this is great. This is right down my alley. I don't care. I'm going to this place. And I got there a little late, and so the person at the front of the room says, well, we don't really have any seats up at the front of the program, but you can sit back in the back with the homebrewers if you want. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I met the most wonderful club of guys, and think about Alaska. About 9 out of 10 people in Alaska either have access to or fly their own plane. All right, so these guys were so gracious. I was kind of like the token guy from the lower 48. So it was it was cold, and they hadn't seen anybody from lower 48 for a while, I guess, and so they adopted me for that week. And these guys, they just bless their hearts. They would call me at my hotel and said, hey, a couple of us are going out tonight to the, Anchorage Brewing Company. Do you want to go with us? I went from there to, I had a little bit of extra time, and I was going to take a scenic tour and drive, do some driving. And they convinced me that, well, there's this little brewery in Homer, Alaska, and we can set you up with the owner if you want. And so, well, what the heck, I'll drive down to Homer. And I did. And when I got there, the owner of the brewery, what was really fascinating was that I got some great beer, and I sat there talking to the owner and the wife, and we had dinner together. And he goes, you just happen to be coming in on the annual Shorebird Festival weekend, And this is Homer is quite, what I learned was that this is the time of the year and one place in the world where if you want to see 13 varieties of cormorants and puffins, this is your deal, okay? And so the next thing I know, the owner of the brew pub had introduced me to a naturalist who were taking people out the next day to see the birds. And this was a small group, about 6 of us, in kayaks. And so here I go from brewery to this experience, and then when I'm just sort of pinching myself, is this really happening here? So then when I get back to Anchorage at the end of the week, they're having their winter brew off, which basically for them is that all of the homebrew guys bring out their equipment from out of their house and they set it up in the brewery's parking lot, and they all brew collectively. Okay, and so I ended up being the guest of honor at the brew off. And before I left, one of the pilots offered to actually take me up and do a personal flight scene tour of Denali. So it sounds really, I know it ain't bragging if it's so, right? So, to me, this was one of the things that sort of motivates me, is it starts by looking for that, but I met an incredible, cast of characters that had their own story to tell, who connected me with other venues and things that I love, that I probably, if I hadn't been quite as adventuresome, but if I hadn't found the right people in the right place with the same interests, it really was a fascinating kind of, and I kind of pinch myself because I've got other sort of travel tales that are along those lines that are a little bit hard to believe, but all us beer people kind of do what I've just said a little bit. We kind of trust our instincts, and we start by saying, I've heard about that wild rice lager. I gotta stop, and that gets me to Minocqua, and the next thing I know, I'm in an antique store or wherever else, it takes you. So thanks for the evening. I think we're going to hang around a little longer, but grab a beer if you want. If you need to go, that's fine. But I've had a great time.
Thank you so much.
If anybody's interested in going in and checking out the system in there, I'd be more than willing to take you in there and kind of explain, the stages, where it goes.
Wow, terrific offer. Thank you so much, Ryan, the Minocqua Brewing Company. Thank you so much, Robin, for driving all the way up from Madison. Thanks again to our sponsors, the Lakeland Badger Chapter, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, Kemp, and Trout Lake, and the library. Remember, our next Science on Tap is the first Wednesday in November. That's November 5th, with Catherine Van de Bosch, Dean of the University of Wisconsin College of Ag and Life Sciences. So we will see you there, and please sign up for our email reminders and join Ryan in the back of his brewing area for a little tour. And thank you again for coming.